Have you ever worried about making a good first impression? A moment of slight anxiety, perhaps, before a job interview or meeting someone new. Now, imagine if that first impression, the way you walked, the person you spoke to first, even the way you handed someone a small piece of paper, could determine your entire future. It's so lovely to have you with us tonight. I'm always so curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you as we begin our story. Please feel free to share in the comments if you'd like. For now, though, I invite you to find a comfortable spot, take a gentle, deep breath, and let the world outside just fade away. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we're opening the door to the 19th century, stepping into a world where politeness was a double-edged sword, and exploring the beautiful, yet brutal, rules of Victorian society. Our journey begins not with a conversation, but with a small piece of pasteboard, a simple object, yet it held the power to open doors or slam them shut forever. This was the calling card, the essential key to navigating the labyrinth of Victorian high society. It was far more than a simple record of a name and address. It was a declaration of your existence, a request for acceptance, and the very first move in a complex and unforgiving social chess match for anyone with aspirations. The calling card was an indispensable tool, a silent ambassador that spoke volumes about one's breeding, status, and intentions before a single word was ever exchanged. Imagine a respectable lady preparing for her afternoon rounds. From a delicate case, perhaps made of tortoiseshell or silver, she retrieves one of her cards. The paper is thick, expensive, with a subtle scent of fine ink. Her card is larger than her husband's, a sign of her role as the household's social gatekeeper. His would be a smaller, plainer affair, purely functional. Hers is an elegant statement. The name engraved upon it is not her own, but her husband's. She is known to the world as Mrs. John Smith, her identity entirely entwined with his. If she were accompanied by her eldest unmarried daughter, the young lady's name, Miss Smith, would be printed just below her own, a subtle announcement of her availability in the social marketplace. Her carriage arrives at a grand townhouse. She will not exit. The ritual of the call does not always require a face-to-face meeting. Her footman takes the card, held carefully in a gloved hand, to avoid any unseemly smudges. He approaches the imposing front door and presents the card to the butler, who answers. The butler does not take it with his own hand, of course. That would be far too personal. Instead, he holds out a small, ornate silver tray known as a salver, reserved for this exact purpose. The crisp, satisfying snap of the engraved card landing on the polished silver echoes in the hushed silence of the grand entryway. This is a moment of quiet judgment. The butler's eyes scan the card, assessing its quality, its name, its silent message. What was that message? It was a language, all its own, communicated through the subtle manipulation of the card itself. If our visiting lady had folded down the top right corner, it would signify that she had delivered it in person, a personal touch. A fold on the top left corner was a message of congratulations, perhaps for a recent marriage or birth in the family. Should she be departing for an extended trip to the countryside or abroad, the letters PPC would be penciled at the bottom. This stood for the French phrase pour prendre congé, meaning to take leave. It was a formal and required way of saying goodbye to her entire social circle at once. The butler disappears inside, the card now in the hands of the lady of the house. A delicate tension hangs in the air. The visiting lady waits in her carriage, her heart perhaps beating just a little faster. Will her call be accepted? The decision rested entirely on the hostess. If the butler returned with the message that the lady was not at home, it was a polite, face-saving refusal. It did not matter if she was, in fact, sitting in her drawing room just a few feet away. The phrase was a shield, a way to control one's social obligations. This was especially true during the prescribed calling hours, typically between the hours of 3 and 5 in the afternoon. To call outside of this window was a serious blunder, implying an intimacy that had not been earned. But there was a far more definitive rejection. If, days later, her own card was returned to her in an envelope, the message was clear and brutal. This was the social equivalent of a slap in the face. It was an unmistakable signal that the acquaintance was not desired, and that all future attempts at contact would be ignored. This was a form of the cut direct, a public severing of ties from which a reputation might never recover. The small card, once a symbol of hope and social ambition, was now an instrument of exile. Even the card itself carried hidden rules. A gentleman, for instance, would never allow the address of his London club to be printed on a card intended for a lady. A club was a male sanctuary, a world of smoke, drink, and conversation considered entirely unsuitable for feminine sensibilities. To include it would be a shocking breach of decorum, and in times of sorrow, the calling card transformed again. A thick black border would be added to its edges, its width indicating the depth of grief and the stage of mourning. It was a public signal to all, a request for quiet sympathy and a temporary withdrawal from the social whirl. This single piece of paper was a passport, a weapon, a message, and a mirror, reflecting one's precise place in a fiercely ordered world. Once your card has been accepted, you have earned an introduction. But this next step is a minefield of its own, governed by who has more social importance. The formal drawing room is now the stage, and the rules of engagement are even more rigid. The air is thick with the faint scents of beeswax floor polish, bay rum cologne from the gentlemen, and the delicate floral perfumes of the ladies. Light from tall windows gleams on the cool, smooth surface of the polished wooden floor. Here, a misspoken word or a clumsy gesture could undo all the careful work of the calling card. The art of the introduction was, at its heart, a public acknowledgement of the social hierarchy. It was a carefully choreographed dance of status, and everyone knew the steps by heart. The cardinal rule was absolute and unshakable. A gentleman was always, without exception, introduced to a lady. Her status, as a woman, was paramount in a social setting. To present a lady to a gentleman would be an unthinkable error, suggesting he was somehow more important than she. The proper phrasing was a formula, precise and unchanging. A host might say, "Mrs. Allen, may I present Mr. Jones?" The gesture was one of offering the gentleman for the lady's consideration. This principle extended to every interaction. The person of lesser rank was always presented to the person of higher rank. A young clerk would be introduced to a wealthy banker. A junior military officer would be presented to his commanding general. Age also played a crucial role. A younger person was invariably introduced to an older person, a sign of deference to their experience and seniority. In the same vein, a young, unmarried woman, no matter how wealthy, was always introduced to a married woman. The state of matrimony granted a woman a higher social standing instantly. She was a matron, a manager of a household, while the unmarried girl was still just a candidate. Imagine the scene. A young man, Mr. Jones, is brought across the room by a mutual acquaintance. The host must physically lead him to where Mrs. Allen is standing. One never shouted an introduction across a crowded room. As they approach, Mr. Jones removes his hat, a gesture of respect he would perform even if they were outdoors. The host speaks the magic words. All eyes are now on Mrs. Allen. A slight, almost imperceptible nod from the Grand Dowager is enough to acknowledge the introduction. A rustle of her silk dress might be heard as she inclines her head. She is not required to speak, and if she chooses not to, a chilling, awkward silence could descend, signaling her disapproval or disinterest. The newly introduced Mr. Jones could do nothing but bow slightly and retreat. The handshake, so common today, was a matter of national debate. In the more socially fluid United States, it was considered a democratic and friendly gesture, exchanged freely upon introduction. But in Britain, it was viewed with suspicion. A gentleman would never presume to offer his hand to a lady. He would simply bow. It was her prerogative, and hers alone, to offer her hand. If she did, he would take it gently, never shaking it with vigor. Her gesture was a signal of warmth and acceptance, a precious reward for a successful introduction. For those hoping to enter a new and exclusive social circle, a simple introduction was often not enough. One needed a sponsor, a validator. This came in the form of a letter of introduction. This was a formal, sealed letter from a trusted mutual acquaintance, essentially vouching for the character and good breeding of the newcomer. It was a written endorsement, a guarantee that this person was worthy of acceptance. To arrive in a new city without such letters was to be a ghost, invisible to the society you wished to join, and under no circumstances was business ever to be mentioned. A social introduction was purely for social purposes. To bring up commerce was considered crass and vulgar, a sign that you saw people not as friends, but as opportunities. Every rule, every phrase, every gesture was designed to reinforce the existing order, creating a predictable and stable social universe. Now that we are properly introduced, we might venture out for a walk. But even this simple act of taking the air was governed by a strict, unspoken code of conduct. The public sphere was a theater, and every respectable person was an actor playing their part. To maintain one's reputation, the performance had to be flawless. The rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets provided the soundtrack, accompanied by the low rumble of carriage wheels and the distant calls of street vendors selling their wares. The city was alive with motion, and navigating it required constant vigilance. A gentleman accompanying a lady had a sacred duty to act as her protector. This began with his position on the pavement. He always walked on the outside, closer to the curb. This seemingly small detail had a very practical purpose. It shielded her expensive dress from the mud and dirty water that might be splashed up by passing carriages. It was a simple, constant gesture of chivalry, placing himself between her and the grime of the street. If they needed to cross the road or turn a corner that switched their orientation, he was expected to deftly maneuver behind her to regain his protective position on the outside. As they walked, they would inevitably encounter acquaintances. Here, another set of rules came into play. If a gentleman passed another male acquaintance, a simple tip of his hat-a-brief, touch to the brim, was sufficient acknowledgement. However, if he passed a lady he knew, the gesture had to be much more pronounced. He was required to fully remove his hat, holding it in his hand as he bowed slightly. For a lady, the rules were different. She was to acknowledge an acquaintance with a slight bow of her head and a pleasant expression, but under no circumstances was she to turn her head to look back at someone after they had passed. To do so was seen as forward and unladylike, suggesting an improper level of interest. The emotional temperature of the street was always to be kept cool and composed. Public displays of emotion, whether boisterous laughter or a visible flash of anger, were considered signs of poor breeding. The ideal was one of serene detachment, a calm and dignified presence. This emotional control extended to personal habits. A lady would never, ever be seen smoking in public. The act was so thoroughly associated with disreputable women that to even be seen with a cigarette would cause a major scandal. Even in private, it was a rare and daring habit for a woman. This code of conduct followed them everywhere. When entering a church, for example, a gentleman would immediately remove his hat as a sign of respect. A lady, however, would keep hers on. Her hat was considered an integral part of her ensemble, and to remove it would be akin to being improperly dressed. As dusk began to fall, and the gas lamps started to flicker on, casting long shadows on the streets, the rules for a lady became even stricter. She would never go out unaccompanied after dark. Her reputation was a fragile thing, and to be seen alone at night would invite ruinous gossip. Even during the day, her independence was limited. It was considered improper for a lady to carry anything more than a small purse or a single small parcel. To be laden with packages suggested she did not have servants to perform such tasks for her, a clear indicator of a lower social status. Perhaps the most brutal tool of public etiquette was the cut direct. We saw its private form with the calling card, but in public it was a swift and devastating act. It was the art of deliberately looking away, of pretending not to see someone you knew perfectly well. It was an intentional, public snub, a declaration to the world that this person no longer existed to you. For the victim, it was a moment of profound humiliation, a social execution performed in broad daylight for all to see. It was a chilling reminder that acceptance was always conditional, and while a gentleman was expected to protect a lady, offering his arm was a gesture reserved for specific circumstances. He could offer it if she were his wife, his mother, his sister, or his fiancée. Otherwise, he only did so if she clearly needed assistance, such as navigating a treacherous crossing or a crowded staircase. To offer it without cause was to imply a level of intimacy that was simply not there. Every step, every glance, every tip of the hat was a calculated part of maintaining one's fragile place in society. Having mastered the public sphere, it is time to face the most daunting of social arenas, the formal dinner party. This was the pinnacle of Victorian social life, a multi-act play where etiquette reached its most complex and intimidating form. An invitation to a dinner at a prestigious home was a sign that you had truly arrived. But it was also a test, a minefield of potential errors where a single slip could lead to social disgrace. Before we even consider the food or the conversation, we must first confront the tools laid out before each guest. The table was a bewildering landscape of polished metal and shimmering glass. As a guest found their place, they would be met with a dazzling reflection of candlelight on a forest of polished silver cutlery. The sheer number of implements was a recent and intimidating development, born from a new style of dining called service à la Russe. Previously, under service à la Francaise, all the dishes for a meal were placed on the table at once. But the Russian style, which became fashionable in the 19th century, involved serving the meal in a series of distinct courses, brought from the kitchen one by one. This meant that each course required its own specific set of tools, leading to a proliferation of silverware that could baffle the unprepared. The array of forks alone was enough to cause anxiety. There was the large dinner fork for the main meat course. Beside it, a slightly smaller fish fork, often with a unique shape. Then there might be a salad fork, a dessert fork, and even a tiny three-pronged oyster fork. Specialized tools abounded. The rule, a new convention for the era, was a simple but crucial lifeline. Work from the outside in. The utensil furthest from the plate on either side was meant for the first course, and so on. The fish knife, for example, was an interesting invention. It was not sharp, as its purpose was not to cut, but to gently separate the delicate flesh of the fish from its bones. Even something as simple as salt was complicated. The modern salt shaker was not yet common. In its place was a salt cellar, a small, open dish of salt, often made of crystal or silver, accompanied by a miniature spoon. Each guest would use the tiny spoon to place a small mound of salt on the side of their plate. To reach across the table or use your own knife to get salt was a grave offense. Before you sat, you would find a heavy, starched linen napkin, often folded into an elaborate shape, resting on your plate. This was to be unfolded and placed on your lap immediately upon being seated. It was never, under any circumstances, to be tucked into one's collar. The glassware, too, had its own language. A water goblet would be present, along with multiple wine glasses of different shapes and sizes for the various wines that would be served with different courses. The proper way to hold a wine glass was by the stem, not the bowl. This was to prevent the warmth of your hand from altering the temperature of the wine, a detail that any true connoisseur would appreciate. As the meal progressed, a servant might appear with a silent butler, a small, silver container with a hinged lid, used to discreetly sweep crumbs from the tablecloth between courses, ensuring the dining surface remained immaculate. Even bread had its own rule. It was never to be cut with a knife at the dinner table. One was to break off a small, bite-sized piece by hand. Finally, when you had finished a course, you had to signal this to the ever-watchful staff. The knife and fork were to be placed neatly parallel to each other on the plate, in the 4 o'clock position, a silent message that your plate could be cleared. The entire setting was a machine for elegant dining, and you were expected to be a flawless operator. You sat there, surrounded by silver and crystal, feeling the weight of the heavy napkin on your lap, breathing in the faint, floral scent of the table's centerpiece, and you felt the weight of being watched, knowing that every eye was upon you, and that a single mistake with the wrong fork could be noticed by everyone. With the table set and the guests seated, the true test of social grace is about to begin. The dinner itself was not just a meal, it was a performance, and we're about to see how it unfolds. It's incredible to think about how much thought went into every single public action, isn't it? From a simple walk down the street to the way you held the fork. Can you even imagine trying to keep track of all these rules today? As we get ready to dive even deeper, I'd love to know what you think. The first course arrives. The low murmur of conversation, so carefully maintained, dips for a moment as plates are placed with practiced silence by the household staff. The warm, savory aroma of the first course, perhaps a delicate consommé or a rich game soup, fills the dining room, mingling with the scent of beeswax and flowers. The soft glow of gaslight on the faces of the diners casts gentle, dancing shadows, creating an atmosphere of intimate formality. For every guest, This is a moment of intense focus. The mental effort of maintaining a pleasant expression, engaging in light conversation, and simultaneously remembering the complex rules of the table is immense. Before the meal even began, the hostess would have spent hours agonizing over the seating plan, the Plan D table. This was not a random arrangement. It was a strategic map of the evening, designed to spark conversation, honor the most important guests, and avoid any awkward pairings. The guest of honor, a high-ranking lady, would be seated to the right of the host, while her husband would be seated to the right of the hostess. From there, couples were separated, and guests were arranged by rank and conversational skill, creating a balanced and harmonious table. A gentleman, upon finding his place, was expected to assist the lady to his right, pulling out her chair and seating her before taking his own seat. It was the first of many small services he was expected to perform. Now, with soup before them, a new challenge presented itself. The proper way to eat soup was an art form in itself. The spoon was to be dipped into the liquid at the edge of the bowl closest to the diner, then moved gently away from the body in a smooth, outward stroke. This prevented any possibility of splashing one's own attire. The soup was then sipped silently from the side of the spoon, never the tip, to make any sound, be it a slurp of soup or the loud clinking of cutlery against china, was a cardinal sin, a clear sign of a vulgar upbringing. Conversation was just as treacherous. There were entire categories of topics that were strictly forbidden. One never discussed money, health, or personal scandals. To do so was considered incredibly gauche. Politics and religion were also off limits, as they were too likely to provoke passionate, unseemly disagreement. The ideal dinner conversation was light, cultured, and impersonal. It touched upon art, literature, music, or amusing anecdotes from one's travels. It was a performance of wit and intellect, but one where strong opinions were carefully veiled. Every word was chosen to be agreeable. The entire flow of this conversation was directed by one person, the hostess. At the start of the meal, she would speak to the gentleman seated on her right. Every other guest was expected to do the same, speaking to the person on their right. The entire table would be a collection of pairs, conversing quietly. Then, at a moment she deemed appropriate, sometime around the main course, the hostess would perform a maneuver known as turning the table. She would gracefully turn her attention to the gentleman seated on her left. This was a silent, powerful signal. Instantly, every single guest was expected to follow her lead and switch their own conversation to the partner on their left. The entire social dynamic of the room shifted in a single, silent moment, all on her command. As the courses continued, new challenges arose. A side dish of asparagus, for instance, was one of the very few foods that could be eaten with the fingers. But even this had a strict procedure, requiring a delicate touch. The true test of one's refined motor skills, however, was the serving of peas. Armed with only a fork, a guest was expected to either spear them individually or, more impressively, gracefully push them onto the back of the fork using a small piece of bread or their knife. Chasing them around the plate was a sign of clumsiness. You could feel the starched collar of your shirt digging into your neck, or the tight lacing of your dress, reminding you to maintain perfect posture as you focused on these tiny, yet significant tasks. Finally, after the dessert course was cleared, another silent signal would pass. The host would wait for a lull in the conversation and make deliberate eye contact with the leading lady guest. She would return the glance with a subtle nod. This was the cue. The hostess would then rise, and all the other ladies at the table would immediately follow suit. The gentlemen would stand as well, remaining on their feet as the ladies retired from the dining room, proceeding to the drawing room for coffee and tea. The dining room doors would close, and the atmosphere would instantly change. The men were now free to talk politics, business, and tell boudoir stories as they enjoyed their port and cigars. The ladies, in their own sanctuary, could engage in more intimate, though still carefully managed, conversation. As the ladies retire to the drawing room, a new form of communication comes into play. It is a language that is silent, secret, and utterly powerful, spoken not with words, but with a flick of the wrist, in the soft light of the drawing room, or later, in the glittering crush of the ballroom, where a direct conversation might be improper or easily overheard. The fan became a lady's most trusted confidant and her secret weapon. It was an object of exquisite beauty, crafted from ivory, mother of pearl, or tortoiseshell, with leaves of delicate silk or paper adorned with intricate, hand-painted scenes. But its true beauty lay in its hidden language. A dozen fans might flutter in unison, creating a soft, whispering sound that filled the room. This was not just a way to create a gentle breeze. It was a symphony of silent messages passing between men and women. An entire courtship could be conducted from across a crowded room, all under the watchful eyes of the chaperones, who might never suspect a thing. The fan, with its subtle scent of the perfume applied to its leaves, could speak a language of its own. The signals were numerous and specific, a code that any fashionable young man or woman would be expected to know. Imagine a young lady who spies a handsome gentleman she wishes to know better. She might carry her open fan in her right hand, holding it in front of her face. This was not a gesture of shyness. It was a clear command: follow me. If their courtship progressed and her feelings deepened, she might place the fan near her heart, a silent and passionate declaration: "You have won, my love." A gentleman could also receive a question. If a lady touched a closed fan to her right eye, she was asking, "When may I be allowed to see you?" It was an invitation to arrange a more private meeting, away from the prying eyes of society. The language could also be used to define a relationship. If a lady, perhaps feeling a suitor, was becoming too forward, were to drop her fan, it was a gentle but firm signal: "We will be friends," and nothing more. The speed of the fan's movement was also significant. A woman, fanning herself slowly and deliberately, was sending a clear message: "I am married." Her affections were already claimed, but if she fanned quickly and energetically, the message was different: "I am engaged." She was spoken for, but perhaps not yet entirely unavailable for a charming conversation. For a more direct declaration of love, a lady might draw her fan across her cheek, or for an even more daring version, hide her eyes behind its open leaves. Both gestures meant the same thing: "I love you." The fan could also serve as a warning. If a lady saw a rival or a gossip approaching, she might begin to twirl the fan in her left hand. The message was urgent and clear: "We are being watched." And for the truly bold, a secret desire could be communicated by touching the tip of the fan to the lips, an unmistakable invitation: "Kiss me." A gentleman could even be put on the spot. If a lady presented her closed fan to him, she was asking a blunt and terrifying question that required an immediate response: "Do you love me?" The glint of light on the fan's ornate sticks was the glint of a blade in a social duel, a silent, elegant, and powerful conversation happening in a room full of noise. This silent language was most useful in the grandest of social settings, the place where fortunes were made and marriages were forged. The ballroom. To receive an invitation to a grand ball at a fashionable home was the height of social success. The air would be thick with the scent of candle wax, beeswax, floor polish, and the mingled perfumes of hundreds of guests. The soaring sound of a live orchestra playing a waltz would echo through the vast, high-ceilinged room, providing the heartbeat for the evening. The sight was dizzying, a kaleidoscope of colorful silk and satin gowns spinning and swirling across the polished floor, a sea of jewels glittering in the brilliant gaslight. For a young, unmarried lady, this was the primary marketplace for marriage, and she could not navigate it alone. The absolute necessity was a chaperone, typically her mother or a married older relative, whose job was to guard her reputation with an eagle eye. The chaperone was her anchor, the person she returned to after every dance, a silent, ever-present guardian against any social misstep. Upon arrival, a young lady would be given one of the most important tools of the evening, a dance card. This carnet de bal was a small, decorative booklet, often with a tiny pencil attached by a silk cord. Here, she would schedule her partners for each dance of the evening. A gentleman wishing to dance would approach and politely ask if he might have the honor of, for instance, the third waltz. If she agreed, he would write his name in the corresponding slot on her card. The rules of the dance card were strict. A gentleman could not simply ask any lady to dance. He must have received a formal introduction. To ask without one was a grave insult. For the lady, the rules were even more binding. She could not refuse a dance request from a suitable gentleman unless her card was already full for that particular dance. To refuse one man out of preference for another was a terrible snub. If she refused, she was obligated to sit out that dance entirely, as proof that her refusal was genuine. To be seen dancing with someone else after refusing another was a social crime. A full dance card was a sign of popularity and success. An empty one was a tragedy. The young woman left sitting by the wall with the chaperones, dance after dance, was known as a wallflower, a deeply embarrassing position that signaled her failure in the social arena. The first and last dances were especially significant, often reserved for her official escort for the evening, or, if she had one, her fiancé. The centerpiece of the evening was the waltz. Though popular with the young, it was still considered slightly scandalous by older generations. The close physical proximity it required, a gloved hand on a lady's back, bodies moving in unison, was a shocking departure from the more formal, hands-off dances of the past. During the dance, a gentleman was expected to make light, polite conversation. Silence was awkward, but overly familiar or personal talk was forbidden. After the music stopped, his duties were not over. He was required to escort his partner directly back to her chaperone, thank her for the honor of the dance, and bow before taking his leave. Amidst the warmth and energy of the crowded room, with punch flowing freely, a gentleman had to be careful. Overindulgence was social suicide, a lapse in control that would be noted by every watchful eye. While the fan had its own language, it was part of a much larger symbolic system used to express feelings that could not be spoken aloud, especially when it came to the delicate dance of courtship. In a world where direct emotional expression was suppressed, Victorians turned to a beautiful and romantic code, the language of flowers. A bouquet was not just a decorative gift, it was a carefully composed letter, a coded message capable of conveying passion, jealousy, friendship, or even a dire warning. This practice, known as florography, was incredibly popular, and nearly every respectable home would have a flower dictionary on hand to help decode the secret messages. The meanings could be complex and nuanced. Some were well known. Red roses, of course, were the ultimate symbol of passionate, romantic love. A white lily represented purity and virtue, making it a common and appropriate gift for a young debutante. But other flowers held more subtle meanings. A yellow rose, for example, could signify friendship, but it could also be a sharp accusation of jealousy. Lavender might mean devotion, but in another context, it could suggest distrust. A sprig of ivy, with its tenacious, clinging nature, was a powerful symbol of fidelity and the desire for marriage. To receive a bouquet containing ivy was a very serious gesture. A small, handheld bouquet, known as a tussie-moussie, was often carefully arranged to convey a specific message and carried 2 balls as a fragrant accessory. The entire composition was a story. A suitor might combine a red rose with a branch of ivy, a message that read, "My passionate love for you is faithful and enduring." The recipient would then read the message in the quiet of her room, her fingers brushing against the delicate texture of a rose petal, the sweet, heady fragrance of the flowers filling the air. The way the bouquet was presented also mattered. If a suitor handed it over with his right hand, the implied answer to a question was yes. If he used his left hand, the answer was a firm no. This language could also be used to convey negative emotions with shocking directness. The herb basil, for instance, conveyed pure hatred. To include it in an arrangement sent to a rival was a silent, fragrant insult. Even more sinister, the beautiful but poisonous aconite, also known as wolfsbane, was a chilling warning. A deadly foe is near. Imagine receiving a stunning arrangement only to find a single, menacing flower hidden within its message, a silent threat. An entire conversation could be had simply by exchanging these small bouquets. The sight of vibrantly colored flowers sitting on a mantelpiece was not just a pretty decoration. It was a secret waiting to be read, a testament to a time when emotions were so constrained that they had to bloom in silent, symbolic form. These intricate rituals of courtship and communication all served one ultimate purpose: securing a suitable marriage. But what happened when the rules were broken? And what were the consequences for those who dared to step outside the tightly drawn lines of respectable society? It's fascinating how people found such creative, silent ways to communicate their true feelings, isn't it? From a glance over a fan to a carefully chosen flower, which of these secret languages do you find the most interesting? Let's take a moment to pause here as our story begins its gentle turn toward a conclusion. We have walked through the public squares and private drawing rooms of the Victorian world. We have learned the intricate steps of its social dances and decoded its silent, secret languages. But beneath the polished surfaces and graceful gestures, there was a deep and persistent fear. It was the fear of a single misstep, a momentary lapse in judgment that could bring the entire glittering facade crashing down. For all the rewards of conformity, the price of imperfection was devastatingly high. This system of etiquette was not merely a guide to politeness, it was a cage, and for those who fell, there was rarely a second chance. This terrifying fate was known as social ruin, a consequence that, for a respectable woman, was often considered worse than death itself. It was a complete and total exile from the world she knew. It was a social death from which there was no resurrection. The transgressions that could lead to such a fate were numerous and often heartbreakingly small. A young, unmarried woman, seen in the company of a gentleman without a chaperone, a private letter intercepted and misinterpreted, or even just a malicious rumor whispered with enough conviction in the right circles. That was all it took. Her virtue, the cornerstone of her value in society, was considered shattered, and with it, her entire identity. The result of this ruin was the emergence of the fallen woman, a figure that haunted the Victorian imagination. She was the subject of cautionary tales, sentimental paintings, and sorrowful novels. Once she was labeled as such, her ostracism was swift and absolute. Imagine the feeling of entering a room, a place where you were once welcomed with warm smiles, only to be met with a deafening silence. The gentle hum of conversation ceases the moment you cross the threshold. Former friends, people you have known your entire life, suddenly find the pattern on the carpet intensely interesting, refusing to meet your gaze. On the street, a familiar face approaches, and for a heart-stopping moment, you feel a flicker of hope, only to watch them turn away, crossing the road to avoid the dishonor of even a simple greeting. That is the feeling of being erased. Invitations, once the lifeblood of her existence, would cease entirely. The steady stream of calling cards would dry up, and the doors of respectable homes, once open to her, would be firmly closed. This was not just a social inconvenience. It was an economic catastrophe. A ruined woman's prospects for a suitable marriage were completely and utterly destroyed. No respectable family would allow their son to marry a woman tainted by scandal. This often meant a life of quiet desperation, living as a dependent on the charity of reluctant relatives, a constant, shameful reminder of a past mistake. The cold, heavy weight of a door being closed to you was both literal and figurative, shutting you out from warmth, from society, and from any hope of a prosperous future. The world shrank until it was nothing more than a sparsely furnished room, lit by the flickering, uncertain light of a single candle, a perfect metaphor for a diminished life. For men, the consequences of social transgressions were typically far less severe, a stark reflection of the era's deep-seated double standards. A man's reputation was built on honor and financial integrity, not chastity. He could be ruined, but it was a different kind of ruin. Being caught cheating at cards or failing to pay a gambling debt could see him blacklisted from the gentlemen's clubs that formed the heart of his social and professional life. This was a serious blow, but it was rarely a permanent exile from society at large. He could often recover. A woman could not. Even actions that seem romantic to us today were fraught with peril. A couple who chose to elope, even with the full intention of getting married, could find themselves shunned by their families and their social circle for defying parental authority. And divorce was the ultimate scandal. It was incredibly rare, legally difficult, and socially catastrophic, almost always resulting in the woman's complete ruin, regardless of the circumstances. Even if she was the innocent party, the mere fact of a public separation was a stain that could never be washed away. The entire system was held in place by the insidious power of gossip. Whispers in drawing rooms, sly implications in letters passed from hand to hand, could build into a storm that could destroy a reputation in a matter of days. A family's honor was a collective burden, and the disgrace of one member, particularly a daughter, could tarnish the marriage prospects of all her siblings. The ultimate goal, the prime directive of Victorian life, was to maintain a spotless public facade, a beautiful and unblemished surface, no matter how much turmoil or unhappiness lay hidden beneath. The fear of ruin was the stick, the constant looming threat that enforced compliance. But for those who navigated the treacherous waters successfully, there was a carrot. For a young woman, the ultimate prize for following every rule with perfect grace was a successful and advantageous marriage. The culmination of her entire upbringing, the journey to the altar, was a carefully managed and deeply serious business. For a young woman of the upper classes, her social life was not for her own amusement. It was a marketplace, and she, in her fine dresses and with her carefully cultivated manners, was the product. Her official entry into this market was a grand ritual known as coming out. This often involved a formal debut, where a young woman, dressed in virginal white, was presented at the royal court. This single event signaled to the world that she was now officially available for marriage. From that moment on, her every public appearance was an audition. Her education and upbringing were all tailored to make her a desirable candidate in this market. While she was expected to be literate and reasonably well-read, she was strongly discouraged from appearing too intelligent, or, worst of all, too opinionated. To be a bluestocking, a woman with intellectual pretensions, was seen as deeply unfeminine and intimidating to potential suitors. Instead, her value was displayed through a set of genteel accomplishments. The gentle, melodic sound of a piano being played softly in a nearby room was the sound of a young woman practicing her art, demonstrating her refinement. The sight of a perfectly stitched piece of embroidery, a testament to hours of patient, quiet, and sedentary work, was proof of her domesticity and her calm temperament. Her ability to paint in watercolors or sing a pleasant tune were not just hobbies. They were indicators of a genteel upbringing and a docile nature, qualities highly prized in a future wife. The entire courtship process was a slow, highly supervised dance. A young couple was almost never left alone together. A parlor visit would be conducted under the watchful eye of a mother or a chaperone. A walk in the park would be taken with a sibling in tow. Every interaction was monitored to prevent any hint of impropriety. A lady was strictly forbidden from writing to a gentleman who was not a close relative, unless, of course, they were formally engaged. To do so would be considered scandalously forward. When a gentleman decided he wished to marry a lady, he could not simply ask her. He first had to seek the permission of her father. This was a formal meeting, often more of a business negotiation than a romantic plea. The suitor would have to prove his financial stability and social standing, assuring the father he was capable of supporting a wife in the manner to which she was accustomed. The size of the bride's dowry, the money or property she brought into the marriage, was a critical factor in these negotiations. Marriage, for the upper classes, was as much an alliance between families as it was a union of two individuals. Only after the father's consent was secured could the gentleman propose to the lady herself. Once she accepted, the engagement was a formal, public matter. An announcement would be printed in prestigious newspapers like the Times for all the world to see. A long engagement was generally frowned upon. It was seen as an unstable, in-between state, a period of time that left too much opportunity for gossip or for one of the parties to change their mind. The wedding itself was the final act of this public play, an event governed by its own host of strict rules, from the white dress and bridal veil, symbolizing purity, to the carefully chosen guests and the traditional wedding breakfast. For a young woman, navigating this market was to live in a constant state of hopeful anticipation, mixed with a deep and gnawing anxiety. Every curtsy, every conversation, every choice of dress was a move in the most important game of her life. The The rules of society governed life's beginning, the careful steps of courtship and marriage. But these rules were perhaps at their most powerful, their most prescriptive, and their most inescapable at life's end. During the solemn and shadowed period of loss and mourning, in the Victorian era, grief was not a private, personal emotion to be processed in one's own way. It was a public performance, a ritual with a strict script, a rigid timeline, and an elaborate costume. It was the final, and perhaps most profound, application of social control, governing the very way one was allowed to feel sorrow. The burden of this performance fell, as usual, most heavily on women. For a widow mourning the loss of her husband, the prescribed period of full mourning was long and arduous. It lasted for a year and a day. During this time, she was expected to live in near seclusion, withdrawing from all social events. There would be no dinner parties, no balls, no joyful gatherings. Her world was to shrink, to become a quiet, muffled space of remembrance. Her clothing was a stark and visible symbol of her grief. Full mourning attire was made of heavy, non-reflective black fabric, most notably crepe, a stiff, scratchy material that was uncomfortable to wear but perfectly signaled the harshness of loss. A matching black veil was worn over her face whenever she went out, shielding her from the world and shielding the world from the sight of her grief. After this first intense year had passed, a widow could transition into second mourning and then half mourning. These stages allowed for a gradual re-entry into the world. The oppressive crepe could be discarded, and fabrics like silk were permitted, though still in black. Eventually, muted colors like gray, mauve, lavender, and violet could be introduced into her wardrobe. The entire process of a widow's mourning could last for 2 years or more, a long, slow journey back to social life, dictated not by her own emotional state, but by the unwritten laws of society. For men, the rules were vastly different. A widower might be expected to wear a simple black suit and a black armband for perhaps 3 months. After that, he was largely free to resume his normal social life. This disparity was a clear reflection of the Victorian view of men and women. Men were active participants in the world of business and politics. They could not be expected to withdraw for long. Women, whose sphere was the home and the heart, were seen as the keepers of emotion and were expected to perform grief for the entire family. This public performance extended to every detail of life. Stationery had to be changed. Any letters written from a house in mourning were penned on paper with a thick black border, the width of the border shrinking as the mourning period progressed. To receive such a letter in the mail was to know its somber news before it was even opened. The hierarchy of grief was meticulously calibrated. While a husband required over 2 years of mourning, the death of a parent or a child might require 1 year. The death of a sibling, 6 months. A first cousin, a mere 6 weeks. Even children were put into mourning clothes, their little gray or black outfits, a public sign of a family's loss. To commemorate the dead, mourning jewelry became incredibly popular. These were pieces made from black materials like jet, a fossilized wood, or lockets would contain a miniature portrait or, most intimately, a lock of hair from the deceased, sometimes intricately woven into beautiful patterns. This practice was given its most powerful and enduring example by Queen Victoria herself. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, she entered a state of deep mourning from which she never truly emerged. For the remaining 40 years of her life, she wore widow's black, setting a somber, powerful cultural precedent that influenced the entire nation. The muffled, quiet atmosphere of a house in mourning, with its curtains drawn against the sunlight, was a microcosm of a society that sought to manage and control even the most profound and uncontrollable of human experiences. This elaborate system of rules, governing everything from a first introduction to a final farewell, from the choice of a fork to the color of a dress, was more than just a list of do's and don'ts. It was more than mere politeness. It was the very architecture of Victorian society, a beautiful, intricate, and deeply controlling structure designed for a very specific purpose. At its core, all of this brutal etiquette was an architecture of control. It was a system designed to maintain a rigid and predictable social hierarchy in an age of rapid, chaotic change. The Industrial Revolution had created a new class of people, the nouveau rich, who had immense wealth but lacked the aristocratic lineage or the ingrained customs of the upper classes. Etiquette, with its thousands of unwritten rules, served as a powerful gatekeeping mechanism. You could buy a grand house, but you could not buy good breeding. Knowing which fork to use, how to leave a calling card, or the correct way to bow was a signal that you belonged, that you were one of the right sort of people. The rules also served to enforce the strict gender roles that defined the era. They disproportionately restricted the freedom of women, confining them to the domestic sphere and defining their value by their purity, docility, and social grace. The ideal woman was the angel in the house, a perfect manager of the home, a serene presence who existed to please her husband and raise respectable children. Etiquette was the training manual for this role, a way to engineer compliant and predictable women who would not challenge the authority of the family patriarch. The entire system prioritized the collective reputation of the family, and by extension, of society, far above the individual happiness or personal freedom of its members. This obsession with external propriety and minute detail was, in many ways, a profound reaction to a world that felt increasingly out of control. The dawn of railways, factories, and sprawling anonymous cities was exciting, but also terrifying. By creating a world of intensely regulated social interaction, the Victorians were attempting to build a fortress of order against the chaos of modernity. The steady, comforting ticking of a grandfather clock in a silent, perfectly ordered room was the ideal they strove for, a feeling they tried to replicate in their own lives. You could see it in their architecture, in the rows of identical townhouses, each with its own polished, respectable facade, giving no hint of the life within. This anxiety about getting it right is evident in the sheer number of etiquette manuals that became bestsellers. Books with titles like Manners and Rules of Good Society, which people studied with an almost religious devotion. Ultimately, this system was a form of social engineering. It was designed to produce citizens who understood their place, who followed the rules, and who would not disrupt the established order. As the British Empire expanded, these rules were exported across the globe, presented as the very pinnacle of civilization, a way to distinguish the civilized from the savage. And so, we can see it for what it truly was, a beautiful, ornate, and gilded cage. It offered security, a sense of belonging, and a predictable path through life. But it also stifled individuality, punished dissent, and demanded the sacrifice of personal freedom for the sake of an orderly surface. And so, the curtains gently close on the grand stage of Victorian high society. What we've seen is that behind every graceful bow and every polite smile there was a complex and often brutal system of control. It was a world of immense beauty and suffocating pressure, where kindness was often less important than correctness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope this story has given you a peaceful space to relax and unwind. If you feel so inclined, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible era in the comments below. For now, though, our main story is complete. I invite you to continue to rest as we explore a few more gentle tangents from this fascinating time. And so, our journey through the gilded halls and shadowed parlors of the Victorian age begins to draw to a close. The intricate dance of etiquette, with its unspoken rules and subtle gestures, has shown us a world both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. But as the candlelight softens and the great house grows quiet, our thoughts can now drift to the silent observers of this grand performance. Let us turn our attention to those who lived their lives just out of sight in the world below stairs. For they, too, were governed by a code as rigid and unyielding as any found in the drawing rooms above. They were the servants, the invisible engine that kept the entire magnificent spectacle in motion. Their world was a universe unto itself, a place of quiet efficiency and strict order. It was a life defined by a rigid hierarchy, a ladder of status as carefully constructed as the one their masters climbed in society. At the very top stood the butler and the housekeeper, the king and queen of the domestic staff. The housekeeper, often a figure of formidable presence, held a ring of keys that granted her access to every storeroom and linen closet. She managed the female staff with a firm hand, ensuring that every bed was perfectly made, every surface gleamed, and the household ran with the precision of a fine watch. Beside her in authority was the butler, the very embodiment of dignified service. He was the master of the dining room, the guardian of the wine cellar, and the general-in-chief of the footmen. His word was law, his standards absolute. Beneath these two figures, the ranks descended in a clear and unforgiving order. There were the footmen, chosen for their height and handsome appearance, their presence a living testament to the family's wealth. There was the cook, reigning over the hot, bustling world of the kitchen. There were the parlor maids, the housemaids, and the ladies' maids, each with their own specific domain. And at the very bottom, in the steam and grime of the scullery, was the scullery maid. She was the lowest of the low, tasked with the most grueling work, her hands perpetually chapped from hot water and harsh soap. The first and most important rule for all of them was to be unseen and unheard. This was not merely a preference, it was a fundamental principle of their existence. The grand houses of the era were designed to enforce this invisibility. Servants moved through a hidden network of back staircases, narrow corridors, and service tunnels. They were ghosts in their own homes, gliding silently through rooms to dust a mantelpiece or light a fire, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. They were trained to avert their gaze, to never make eye contact with a member of the family or a guest unless they were spoken to directly. To do so would be an act of gross impertinence, a momentary breach of the invisible wall that separated their worlds. Their purpose was to facilitate a life of effortless comfort for their employers. And the illusion of effortlessness required that the labor itself remain completely hidden from view. The language they used was a constant reminder of their station. They addressed their employers with a formal deference that never wavered. It was always sir or ma'am, or, for the aristocracy, the correct title, such as my lord or your ladyship. This was not just politeness, it was a linguistic uniform, a way of speaking that reinforced the vast social distance between them every single day. The butler, for his part, was the ultimate authority on the complex rituals of dinner service. He was responsible for training the footmen, teaching them how to pour wine without dripping a single drop, how to present a dish at the correct shoulder, and how to clear the table with swift, silent grace. Before a grand dinner, you might find him in the pantry, his brow furrowed in concentration as he inspected the polished silver, each fork and spoon being carefully laid out on a soft cloth, its placement as critical as a general deploying his troops before a battle. Their clothing was another symbol of their role. Uniforms or livery were essential. These were not chosen for comfort. The fabric was often heavy, woolen, and restrictive, but it served a vital purpose. It signified a servant's specific role within the household, and just as importantly, it advertised the wealth and status of the family they served. A family with a dozen footmen in immaculate, matching livery was making a very public statement about their standing in the world. For the servants themselves, putting on the uniform each morning was a way of putting on their professional identity, leaving their personal selves behind. Yet, within this world of rigid uniformity, some roles allowed for a strange kind of intimacy. A lady's maid, for instance, lived in a unique space between servant and confidant. She helped her mistress dress and undress, styled her hair, and cared for her delicate clothes. She was privy to her mistress's private moods, her secret anxieties, and her most intimate conversations. This required the utmost discretion, for a lady's maid knew secrets that could ruin reputations. She was a silent keeper of confidences, her loyalty an absolute necessity. Interestingly, the strict class distinctions of the world above were often perfectly mirrored in the world below. In the servants' hall, where the staff took their meals, the social order was meticulously observed. The butler would sit at the head of the table, with the housekeeper at his side. The other senior servants, like the cook and the lady's maid, would sit near them. The seating would then be arranged by rank, all the way down to the scullery maid and the boot boy, who sat at the farthest end. The rules of conversation and behavior at this table were often just as formal as those in the grand dining room upstairs. It was a small, contained society, with its own intricate politics and unspoken rules. Communication from upstairs often came in the form of a summons, a sound that could cut through the quiet of the house at any moment. This was the system of service bells. A complex array of wires ran through the walls, connecting each room to a panel in the servants' quarters. Each bell had a slightly different tone, and a small flag would drop to indicate which room required service. The library, the morning room, the master bedroom. A faint, distant ringing was a call to action, demanding an immediate and swift response. It meant a servant had to drop whatever they were doing and hurry to answer the call. Their life lived in a state of perpetual readiness, and the stakes were incredibly high. A servant's position was always precarious. They could be dismissed instantly for any number of perceived offenses. The charge of insolence, for example, was a constant threat, and it could mean anything from speaking out of turn to simply having a look on one's face that was deemed improper by an employer. One wrong move, one moment of frustration that showed on the features, could mean being cast out with no reference, a devastating prospect in an age with no social safety net. Their lives were a constant performance of deference and humility. A delicate balancing act played out against the backdrop of long hours and exhausting work, and through it all, there were the quiet, sensory details of their world. The faint, persistent smell of coal soap and starch that clung to their quarters. The feeling of their heavy woolen clothing, especially on a warm day. The quiet, efficient sound of their footsteps as they moved through the silent house, carrying out the endless tasks that made the Victorian ideal of domestic perfection possible. And so, this world of rules was not confined to Britain. As the empire grew, these customs traveled with it, shaping societies around the globe. As we let our thoughts drift further, we can almost imagine the gentle clinking of porcelain teacups, not in a misty English garden, but on a wide veranda overlooking a lush, tropical landscape. This was the world of the British Empire, and Victorian etiquette was one of its most potent and pervasive exports. It became more than just a set of social rules. It was a powerful tool, a way to assert a sense of cultural superiority and to create a familiar sense of Britishness for colonial administrators and their families living in foreign lands that felt overwhelmingly strange and different. It was a way to maintain order and identity, a shield against the unfamiliar world outside their bungalow walls. The ritual of afternoon tea, for example, became a quintessential symbol of British colonial life. Every day, as the sun reached a certain point in the sky, work would pause. Tables would be set with fine china, silver teapots, and plates of delicate sandwiches and cakes. It was a moment of civilized calm, a deliberate recreation of a comforting English tradition in the heart of India, Africa, or the Caribbean. The scent of exotic flowers from the garden might mingle with the familiar, comforting smell of brewing Earl Grey tea, creating a unique sensory blend of the foreign and the domestic. This daily ceremony was a way of marking time, of maintaining a rhythm of life that was distinctly British, no matter how far one was from home. It was a small island of predictability in a sea of cultural uncertainty. In these colonial outposts, the wives of British officials were often seen as the primary guardians of moral and social propriety. They were tasked with the immense responsibility of recreating the ideal English home, transforming a simple bungalow into a bastion of Victorian values. They managed the local servants, organized social gatherings, and ensured that every detail, from the placement of the furniture to the menu for dinner, adhered to the strict standards of home. This placed an enormous pressure on them to be perfect hostesses, perfect wives, and perfect representatives of the British way of life. They were the keepers of the cultural flame, and the weight of that duty, in a warm, humid climate so different from England, must have been immense. The slow, rhythmic waving of a handheld fan was the constant, necessary companion to their formal lives. To escape the pressures of both work and domesticity, colonial gentlemen sought refuge in another great British institution, the Gentlemen's Club. In bustling cities like Calcutta or Singapore, these clubs were strict enclaves of British culture and etiquette. Inside their cool, dark walls, members could surround themselves with the familiar comforts of home. They could read English newspapers, dine on traditional British food, and converse with their peers, all while the vibrant, chaotic life of the foreign city continued just outside the gates. These clubs had strict rules of conduct and dress, and they were a space where the hierarchies of the colonial administration were reinforced. They were a home away from home, a place to reaffirm one's identity as an Englishman in a world that constantly challenged it. This desire to impose Britishness on the landscape extended to architecture itself. All across the empire, homes were constructed that mimicked British styles, often with little consideration for the local climate. Parlors were filled with heavy, upholstered furniture. Dining rooms were designed for formal, multi-course meals. Windows were often small and covered with thick curtains, designed to keep out the drafts of an English winter rather than to welcome the breezes of a tropical evening. These houses were physical statements, imposing a familiar structure onto an unfamiliar environment, even when that structure was completely impractical. Outside the brightly lit windows of such a colonial bungalow, the sound of crickets chirping would serve as a constant reminder of the vastly different world that lay just beyond the manicured lawn. As the British established their power, local elites in places like India often found it necessary or advantageous to adopt Victorian manners and dress. Navigating the new colonial power structure required understanding its codes, and so many began to learn the intricacies of Western dining, the art of formal conversation, and the rules of social calls. They wore English-style clothing, sometimes even the absurdly impractical formal woolen suits, in order to be taken seriously by their colonial rulers. This adoption of manners was a complex act, sometimes a strategy for advancement, sometimes a genuine admiration for the culture, and often a difficult blend of both. The deeply ingrained system of leaving calling cards was dutifully replicated in colonial capitals, with the same complex rules about whose calls must be returned and in what order. It was a social game with high stakes, played out far from the London drawing rooms where it was invented. The imposition of these customs was a deliberate part of what was called the civilizing mission. British missionaries, alongside teaching the tenets of Christianity, often taught Western etiquette. They believed that adopting proper table manners, wearing Western clothes, and organizing one's home according to British standards were outward signs of an inner moral improvement. Politeness was seen as being next to godliness. This intertwined teaching of religion and manners had a profound and lasting cultural impact on the colonized nations, creating a complex legacy that is still being debated and understood today. Even sports became a vehicle for these values. The game of cricket, with its complex rules and deep emphasis on fair play and gentlemanly conduct, spread throughout the empire. It was more than just a game. It was seen as a training ground for character, a way to instill British values of integrity and sportsmanship. And as the sun would set over a landscape so vastly different from the green fields of the English countryside, the echoes of these imposed customs would settle deep into the cultural fabric of these lands. For while the empire itself has faded into history, many of the core tenets of Victorian politeness have not, leaving faint but discernible traces in our lives today. It is a curious thing to consider, as we settle into a state of quiet contemplation, how the ghosts of these long-dead rules still walk among us. We may have shed the corsets and the top hats, but the legacy of Victorian etiquette is woven more deeply into the fabric of our modern lives than we might imagine. Many of the simple courtesies we practice instinctively, the small rituals of politeness that smooth our daily interactions, are in fact simplified echoes of that much more rigid and demanding system. They are the lingering whispers of a world that placed immense value on social harmony and outward appearances. Think, for instance, of the simple act of queuing, of forming an orderly line. This concept became deeply ingrained in British culture during the Victorian era. As cities grew more crowded with the boom of the Industrial Revolution, a new kind of social order was needed to manage the masses. The queue was a democratic and fair solution, a silent agreement that each person would wait their turn. There is a quiet, shared understanding in a perfectly orderly queue, a miniature social contract that we honor without a second thought. This instinct for orderly waiting is a direct inheritance from our Victorian ancestors, who first had to navigate the challenge of living peacefully in close quarters with thousands of strangers, or consider the tradition of sending a thank you note. In our age of instant digital communication, the act of sitting down to write a letter feels wonderfully deliberate and personal. The feel of a good pen gliding smoothly over a piece of nice stationery, the careful selection of words to express gratitude. The journey of the letter through the mailet is all a ritual. This ritual is a direct descendant of the elaborate letter-writing etiquette of the Victorians, for whom correspondence was a vital art form. A handwritten note of thanks was not just polite, it was an absolute requirement, a way of acknowledging a kindness and strengthening a social bond. The warm, pleasant feeling of receiving an unexpected letter in the mail today is a small taste of how important that connection once was. Our basic table manners, too, are a collection of Victorian principles that have been passed down through generations. The familiar parental reminders to not speak with your mouth full, to not chew loudly, and to keep your elbows off the table were all codified and popularized in this era. These rules were not arbitrary. They were designed to make the communal act of eating more pleasant and civilized. They were a way of showing respect for the people you were dining with, a small performance of self-control and consideration. Even the simple, comforting ritual of setting a table for a family meal, with forks on the left and knives on the right, follows a pattern established in the 19th century. The handshake, that most common of greetings in the professional and social world, was also solidified as the standard during this period. In a society that was becoming more industrial and business-oriented, the handshake was a more egalitarian gesture than the formal bow or curtsy of earlier eras. It suggested a transaction between equals, a sign of trust and good faith. Its firmness, its duration, its accompanying eye contact hall became part of a new, more modern code of interaction. Similarly, the now common acronym RSVP, taken from the French phrase Répondez s'il vous plaît, meaning please respond, became a formal expectation on invitations. In a world of carefully planned dinner parties and social events, the hostess needed to know who was coming. It marked a shift towards a more organized and scheduled social life. Many of our most cherished traditions surrounding love and marriage also have their roots in this formal age. The tradition of a young man asking his prospective father-in-law for his blessing before proposing is a softened, romanticized version of the formal marriage negotiations of the Victorian upper classes. In that time, marriage was often as much a financial and social alliance between families as it was a union of two individuals. Today, the gesture remains as a sign of respect for family and tradition. And the image of the bride in a flowing white gown, we have Queen Victoria herself to thank for that. When she married Prince Albert in 1840, she chose to wear a white dress, a choice that was unusual at the time. Her immense popularity and the widespread publication of images from her wedding turned the white wedding dress into an enduring symbol of purity and romance that continues to this day. Even our unconscious gestures of politeness often carry a Victorian echo. The concept of a man holding a door open for a woman or offering her his seat are direct carryovers from the gendered code of chivalry that was so central to the era's etiquette. These actions were based on the idea of the gentleman as a protector of the weaker sex. While the meaning and appropriateness of these gestures are debated today, their origins are firmly planted in the 19th century. And as we move through our modern, crowded cities, the very idea of respecting personal space, of not standing too close to a stranger in an elevator or on a train, is another Victorian notion. It was a necessary adaptation to urban life, a way of maintaining a sense of privacy and decorum in the midst of an anonymous crowd. The home, too, became a place of carefully managed spaces. The idea of having a guest bathroom, a clean and impersonal space for visitors, comes from the Victorian separation of the public and private areas of the house. The family's personal lived-in spaces were kept hidden, while the formal rooms, like the parlor, were always ready for display. And so, as the gentle sound of rain might tap against a window pane, providing a perfect moment for quiet reflection, we can see the outlines of their world in the small, unconscious habits of our own. But beyond the rules themselves, we can wonder about the inner world of those who lived by them and the quiet psychological toll it may have taken. In these last, final moments of reflection, let us consider the inner life of the Victorian individual. Let us think about the psychological weight of living in a world of such intense and constant scrutiny. It was an era that prized the facade, the outward performance of propriety above all else. This created a profound and often painful division between the public self, which had to be perfect and controlled, and the private self, where all the messy, complicated, and forbidden thoughts resided. The constant effort of maintaining this perfect mask, day in and day out, must have carried a quiet, persistent anxiety. This is why the era is so famous for its private diaries and journals. These leather-bound books, filled with looping, handwritten script, were the secret sanctuaries of the Victorian mind. They were the one place where an individual could be truly honest, where they could express the thoughts and feelings that were utterly forbidden in public society. Flipping through one of these diaries today, one can feel the immense release in the words on the page. Here, a person could confess their frustrations, their secret affections, their doubts, and their anger, all without fear of judgment. The diary was a necessary valve for the immense pressure that built up beneath the calm surface of propriety. It was a space to be real in a world that demanded performance. It is no coincidence that the field of psychoanalysis, with its focus on the hidden depths of the mind, was born in the twilight of the Victorian age. Sigmund Freud's theories, which emerged in the late 19th century, were in many ways a direct response to the culture around him. The concept of repression, the idea that desires and memories, when pushed out of conscious awareness, continue to exert a powerful influence on our behavior, became a cornerstone of his work. This was a perfect description of the Victorian psychological landscape. An entire society was engaged in a collective act of repression, and psychoanalysis was the science that sought to understand what happened to all the feelings that were pushed below the surface. For women, in particular, the emotional and intellectual constraints of their lives could be devastating. Hysteria was a common medical diagnosis of the time, a catch-all term for a wide range of symptoms, including anxiety, fainting, and emotional outbursts. Today, we understand that this was not a true medical condition, but rather a physical manifestation of the deep frustrations felt by women who were denied education, careers, and personal autonomy. Their lives were so tightly constrained that their bodies began to protest in the only way they could. The infamous rest cure, prescribed for such women, which often involved being confined to bed in a dark room and forbidden from reading or writing, was in effect a prescription for total silence, a final quelling of the unexpressed self. The popular literature of the time brilliantly reflected this societal duality. The Gothic novel, with its haunted houses, hidden secrets, and monstrous doubles, was the perfect genre for exploring the darkness that lurked beneath the polished veneer of Victorian life. Robert Louis Stevenson's Tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is perhaps the most famous example. The story of a respectable doctor who transforms into a depraved monster is a powerful metaphor for the divided Victorian soul. It captured the terrifying idea that beneath the surface of every civilized gentleman there was a savage beast struggling to get out. Every individual, and indeed the entire culture, had a hidden shadow self. The home was relentlessly idealized as a safe haven, a perfect, peaceful refuge from the harsh, competitive world of industry and commerce. This placed an almost unbearable pressure on women, who, as the angels of the house, were expected to create and maintain this domestic paradise. Any sign of discord, mess, or unhappiness in the home was seen as a personal and moral failure on her part. This ideal of domestic perfection could turn the home from a sanctuary into a prison, a place of endless, unacknowledged labor and emotional management. The constant performance of propriety, whether in public or at home, could lead to a profound sense of emotional alienation. If one's outward expression must always be calm, polite, and cheerful, regardless of one's true inner state, it could become difficult to even know what one truly felt. There was a constant gap between internal feeling and external appearance, a disconnect that could be incredibly lonely. The emphasis on external appearances over internal feelings was a defining characteristic of the culture. It mattered less who you were on the inside and more how you presented yourself to the world. Your clothing had to be immaculate, your posture perfect, your facial expression placid. Even leisure activities were meant to be productive and morally upright. Hobbies like painting, playing a musical instrument, or collecting botanical specimens were encouraged because they were seen as improving. There was very little room for pure, unstructured fun or simple, unproductive relaxation. It is impossible not to wonder how much creativity and individuality was stifled by this immense pressure for conformity. How many brilliant ideas were never expressed? How many unconventional lives were never lived, because they did not fit within the narrow confines of what was considered acceptable? But no system of control can last forever. The very end of the Victorian era saw the rise of powerful countercultural movements that explicitly rejected these strictures. The Bohemian and aesthetic movements championed art for art's sake, individual expression, and a life guided by beauty and feeling rather than by rigid social rules. They were the inevitable backlash, the pendulum swinging back from a culture of repression to one of liberation. They were the first signs of the modern world, a world that would, for better or for worse, begin to value authenticity over the perfect, polished mask. And as we feel the comforting weight of a heavy blanket on a cool night, we can imagine the quiet solitude of a library surrounded by the silent stories of others who lived and dreamed and struggled within that gilded cage. Our reflective journey through the echoes of the Victorian age now comes to its gentle close, leaving just a few final, peaceful thoughts to guide us into rest. In these quiet reflections, we can feel the faint echoes of this long-ago world in our own blood. The desire for order, the comfort of tradition, and the quiet tension between our private thoughts and our public faces are all threads that connect us to the past. Thank you for taking this thoughtful journey with me. As we drift further into a state of rest, we hope these tranquil stories have served as a gentle companion for your dreams. And so, as we settle into these final, quiet moments, let our minds drift away from grand narratives and sweeping histories. Let us instead open a cabinet of curiosities, a collection of small, peaceful details from this bygone world. There is no story to follow now, only a series of gentle explorations, each one a self-contained world designed to offer a soothing and dreamlike backdrop for your rest. Let the sentences meander, and allow the sounds and scents of the era to become a soft cushion for your thoughts as you prepare for deep and tranquil sleep. Our first visit is to a quiet room late at night. Here, under the soft, warm glow of an oil lamp, we find the peaceful world of Victorian correspondence. This was a golden age of letter writing, a time when the written word was a cherished art form. Before the telephone, the letter was the most intimate thread connecting friends and family across distances. It was a slow, thoughtful, and deeply personal form of communication, a world away from the instant messages of our own time. This flourishing of personal mail was made possible by a simple but revolutionary invention. The arrival of the penny black stamp in the year 1840 democratized the post. For the first time, sending a letter became affordable for nearly everyone, not just the wealthy. A vast and intricate network of communication suddenly spread across the country, and people began to write to each other with incredible frequency. The postbox became a vital part of daily life, a portal for sending and receiving news, gossip, and declarations of the heart. To craft a proper letter was to engage in a small, satisfying ritual. It began with the right tools. A writer would need a sheet of good quality paper, its texture a quiet promise of the words to come. They would use a dip pen, its steel nib carefully chosen for the desired style of handwriting, and beside it, an open bottle of ink, perhaps the dark, earthy iron gall ink. It sent a familiar part of the writing process. Each element was simple, yet together they formed the foundation of a highly refined art. The process of writing with a dip pen required a slow and steady hand to prevent the wet ink from smudging and ruining a carefully written page. Blotting paper was essential. This soft, absorbent paper would be gently pressed onto the fresh script, lifting any excess ink without blurring the lines. It was a simple but crucial step, a moment of pause in the flow of writing that ensured the final letter would be clean, crisp, and beautiful. Paper was a precious commodity, and so was the cost of postage, which was often based on the number of sheets. To save on both, a clever technique known as crossed writing was often employed. A person would fill the entire page with horizontal lines of text, and then, rather than taking a new sheet, they would simply turn the page 90 degrees. They would then continue their letter, writing vertically over their own original script. The result was a dense, web-like grid of words that, while difficult to read, was a marvel of economy. The final touch for a formal letter was the seal. A small amount of colored sealing wax would be melted onto the folded edge of the paper. Then, while the wax was still warm and soft, the sender would press their personal signet ring into it. This would leave a unique, raised impression, a family crest, a coat of arms, or a set of initials. The feeling of the cool metal pressing into the warm wax was a deeply personal act. It made the letter a secure and authentic object, a message sealed with the sender's own identity. Breaking that seal was a satisfying crackle, the sound of a private world being opened. The very choice of stationery was a form of communication in itself. The color of the paper, its thickness, and its size all sent subtle signals. A letter of condolence, for example, would be written on heavy paper with a thick black border. A friendly note might be on a smaller, cream-colored sheet. A gentleman's paper was typically plain and substantial, while a lady might have hers embossed with a delicate monogram. Long before a single word was read, the letter itself had already begun to speak. The language of the letter was just as codified. There were strict formulas for how one should begin and end a correspondence, all depending on the sender's relationship to the recipient. A business letter might start with a formal "Dear Sir," while a letter to a loved one could begin with "My dearest." The closing was just as important, ranging from a formal "Yours faithfully" to an affectionate "Your loving son." These conventions provided a clear and comfortable structure for expressing one's thoughts. In a city like London, the postal service was astonishingly efficient. Mail could be collected and delivered multiple times throughout the day. This allowed for a near constant stream of communication, a conversation carried on through handwritten notes that could be exchanged in a matter of hours. One could send an invitation in the morning and receive a reply by the afternoon. It was a system that encouraged a culture of constant, thoughtful connection. For a lady of the house, writing was a central part of her daily duties. She would often have a special desk, a small and elegant piece of furniture called a secretaire. This was her personal domain, a place where she would manage her household correspondence, write in her diary, and reply to social invitations. It was a quiet corner of the house dedicated to the slow and deliberate craft of the written word, a place where the only sound was the gentle scratching of a steel nib on paper. From the quiet contemplation of the written word, our thoughts now drift to another refined and gentle pastime. We leave the lonely writing desk and move into the soft, sunlit comfort of the parlor, where a different kind of ritual is about to unfold, the gentle art of taking tea. Let us settle now into the warm and pleasant atmosphere of a mid-afternoon. This is the time for that most English of rituals, afternoon tea. This was never just a simple snack. It was a structured and elegant social occasion, a pause in the day for quiet conversation and delicate food. It was a ceremony of comfort, served on the finest china, with its own gentle rules of conduct that transformed a simple cup of tea into a moment of refined grace. The creation of this ritual is credited to one woman, Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, in the early 1840s. In her day, the evening meal was served later and later, sometimes not until 8 or 9 o'clock. The Duchess found herself suffering from a sinking feeling in the long gap between a light lunch and a late dinner. Her solution was to request a tray of tea, bread and butter, and cake to be brought to her room in the late afternoon. She soon began inviting friends to join her, and the delightful custom quickly spread throughout high society. A proper afternoon tea was a beautiful sight to behold. It was traditionally served on a 3-tiered stand. The bottom layer was for the savory course, consisting of small, elegant finger sandwiches. The middle tier held the scones, served warm with jam and clotted cream, and at the very top, a tempting collection of sweet cakes, pastries, and other confections. One was meant to start at the bottom and work their way up, a gentle culinary journey from savory to sweet. The sandwiches themselves were an exercise in delicacy. They were always made with thin slices of bread, and the crusts were meticulously cut off, leaving soft, perfect rectangles or triangles. The fillings were simple but refined. Thinly sliced cucumber, egg, and cress, smoked salmon with cream cheese, or delicate chicken salad were all popular choices. They were light, refreshing, and designed to be eaten neatly in just a few bites. The scone, of course, is the heart of any afternoon tea, and it comes with a great and long-standing debate. In the county of Cornwall, the tradition is to spread the jam on the warm scone first, followed by a generous dollop of clotted cream. But in the neighboring county of Devon, the order is reversed: cream first, then jam. It is a friendly rivalry that continues to this day, a charming quirk in the history of this beloved ritual. The sweet taste of strawberry jam and rich cream on a warm, fluffy scone is a simple, perfect pleasure. There was, naturally, an etiquette to drinking the tea itself. The cup was never to be stirred in a vigorous, circular motion. Instead, one was to gently move the spoon back and forth in a straight line, from the 6 o'clock to the 12 o'clock position, just a few times. This was to be done as quietly as possible, without clinking the spoon against the delicate china. After stirring, the spoon was not to be left in the cup. It was to be placed neatly on the saucer, just behind the cup. How one held the teacup was also a matter of some importance. The handle of the cup, which has a cool, smooth feel, should be held delicately between the thumb and forefinger, with the middle finger offering gentle support underneath. The popular image of extending one's little finger or pinky is largely a myth. In Victorian times, this was actually considered pretentious and a sign of poor breeding. A graceful and steady hand was the desired effect. The hostess was always the one to pour the tea. She would often ask her guests, "Shall I be mother?" a charming phrase that simply meant, "Shall I pour?" It was her role to manage the teapot, ensuring that each guest received a fresh, hot cup of tea, served exactly to their liking, whether they preferred it strong or weak. A small detail that often goes unnoticed is the question of milk. In Victorian times, milk was almost always added to the cup after the tea was poured, not before. The reason was practical. Much of the fine bone china was incredibly delicate, and it was feared that pouring boiling hot tea directly into an empty cup could cause the porcelain to crack. Adding the cooler milk first was a later invention, but the traditional method was tea first, then milk. For ladies enjoying afternoon tea in the comfort of their own homes, there was a special form of dress known as the tea gown. These were beautiful, flowing dresses that were much less restrictive than the tightly corseted gowns worn for public occasions. The tea gown was a symbol of informal elegance and comfort, a chance for a woman to relax in a private, intimate setting with her closest friends, surrounded by the warm, comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea. As the peaceful afternoon fades, and the last of the scones have been enjoyed, our attention turns to the room itself. We are in the Victorian parlor, the very heart of the home, a space filled with objects and customs that speak of a fascination with wonder and curiosity. Let us now explore this quintessential Victorian room, the parlor. This was the public face of the home, the chamber where guests were formally received and entertained. As such, it was a carefully curated showcase of the family's wealth, taste, education, and moral character. Every object in the room, from the furniture to the smallest ornament, was chosen to tell a story about the people who lived there. The faint, pleasant scent of dried flowers, beeswax polish, and old books would often fill the air. The dominant style of the era was one of rich, detailed abundance. Parlors were often filled to the brim with furniture, textiles, and decorative objects. This tendency towards clutter, a concept later given the name hor vacui, or fear of empty space, meant that every surface was a canvas for display. This was not seen as messy, but as a sign of prosperity and intellectual curiosity. It created a room that was a dense and complex world, inviting the eye to wander and discover. A popular feature in a well-appointed parlor was the cabinet of curiosities. This was a special display case filled with fascinating objects collected by the family. Here, one might find an array of seashells from a seaside holiday, interesting fossils discovered on a country walk, or perhaps a colorful taxidermy bird. For wealthier families who traveled, the cabinet might hold exotic artifacts from the far corners of the British Empire. It was a miniature museum of the family's experiences and interests. The silent, watchful glass eyes of a taxidermy owl on a shelf might follow you as you moved through the room. The Victorians had a great passion for nature, and they found clever ways to bring it indoors. A craze for ferns, known as pterodomania or fern fever, swept the nation. This was made possible by the invention of the Wardian case, a kind of miniature greenhouse or terrarium. This sealed glass container created a humid environment that allowed delicate ferns and other exotic plants to thrive inside the often dark and polluted air of a city home. The windows of the parlor were almost always dressed with heavy velvet curtains. These thick plush drapes served several purposes. They demonstrated wealth, as fabric was expensive, and they also provided insulation. But most importantly, they were used to block out the harsh light of the sun, which could fade expensive textiles, and to create a sense of seclusion from the perceived grime and chaos of the industrial city outside. The complex pattern of light filtering through an inner lace curtain into the dim, quiet room created a peaceful, almost sanctuary-like atmosphere. The new technology of photography revolutionized the way families recorded their own history, and the parlor was where this history was displayed. Family photographs were everywhere, arranged on the mantelpiece, placed on small tables, and hung on the walls in ornate frames. These serious, unsmiling portraits of ancestors and children were a constant, visible reminder of family lineage and continuity. The focal point of the room was almost always the mantelpiece above the fireplace. This shelf became a stage for the family's most prized possessions. A handsome clock would often sit in the center, its muffled ticking the only sound in the still room. It would be flanked by a symmetrical arrangement of vases, figurines, and other cherished ornaments, creating a perfectly balanced and pleasing display. To protect the furniture, small cloths called antimacassars were draped over the backs and arms of chairs. The name came from macassar oil, a popular but greasy men's hair product that would otherwise stain the fabric. These often lacy, crocheted cloths are a perfect example of the practical and decorative mindset of the Victorian homemaker. They were a simple solution to a common problem, executed with a touch of elegance. For a middle-class family, owning a piano was a powerful symbol of refinement and social aspiration. The piano became the centerpiece of the parlor, a source of evening entertainment long before the invention of the radio or television. A daughter's ability to play the piano well was a sign of a good upbringing, and family gatherings often centered around music and song in the warm, inviting space of the parlor. To protect and elevate their most delicate treasures, Victorians often placed them under glass domes, known as cloches. A beautiful shell, a piece of intricate coral, or a spray of wax flowers would be enshrined beneath the glass. This simple act of separation transformed an ordinary object into a precious artifact, something to be looked at and admired, but not touched. It added to the room's museum-like quality, a world of wonders held in perfect, silent stillness. From the carefully curated heart of the home, we take one final, gentle step. Our journey leads us out of the dim parlor and into the quiet, ordered world of the Victorian garden. Our final destination on this tranquil journey is the Victorian garden. This was far more than just a patch of land behind a house. It was a private sanctuary, a place of carefully cultivated nature that offered a peaceful and restorative escape from the noise and pace of the industrializing world. Let us wander for a moment along its winding paths, listen to its gentle sounds, and appreciate the quiet, ordered beauty that it offered. The dream of owning a garden became a reality for many during this era. With the rise of the middle class and the development of the suburbs, more families than ever before had their own private plot of land. The suburban garden was a personal retreat, a small piece of the idealized countryside that could be shaped and tended to as a reflection of the family's taste and diligence. The soft, earthy smell of damp soil after a light rain would hang sweetly in the air. A signature feature of the Victorian garden was the practice of bedding out. This was a new and exciting style of planting, where masses of brightly colored annual flowers were planted in intricate patterns or beds. These displays created a vibrant, carpet-like effect that would last for a single season before being replaced the following year. It was a bold and cheerful look, a celebration of the new and exotic flower varieties that were being introduced from around the world. The gentle, buzzing sound of bees moving from one bright blossom to another was the garden's constant, peaceful music. A lush, green lawn was another powerful status symbol. The invention of the mechanical lawnmower in the 1830s made it possible to maintain large swaths of perfectly manicured grass. A pristine lawn was a sign of prosperity, suggesting that the owner had both the land to spare and the leisure time, or paid staff, to keep it in immaculate condition. It provided a calm, green canvas against which the vibrant flower beds could be displayed. Advances in technology also transformed the garden. Cheaper methods for producing glass and iron led to the popularity of greenhouses and conservatories. These beautiful glass structures, often attached to the house, allowed gardeners to cultivate exotic and tender plants that could not survive the British climate. They were warm, light-filled spaces, filled with the scent of orchids and citrus trees, a miniature tropical world in an English garden. It became fashionable to create rock gardens, or rockeries. These were carefully constructed mounds of earth and stone, designed to replicate miniature alpine landscapes. They were planted with small, hardy plants that would naturally grow in mountainous regions. The rockery was a reflection of the Victorian love of science, travel, and the romantic, untamed beauty of nature, all captured in a small, domestic scale. Scattered throughout the garden, one would find places for quiet rest and contemplation. Cast-iron benches, often painted a dark, unassuming green or black, were a common feature. Placed under the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves of a large tree, They offered a perfect spot to read a book, to engage in quiet conversation, or to simply sit and admire the beauty of one's surroundings. The garden was often viewed as a moral space, an extension of the values that governed the home. Tending to plants was seen as a healthy and virtuous activity, a way to appreciate the beauty of God's creation. For women and children, in particular, the garden offered a safe and respectable outdoor environment for gentle exercise and fresh air, away from the corrupting influences of the city. For moments of greater privacy, a garden might include a secluded gazebo or a charming summer house. These small, sheltered structures, often tucked away in a quiet corner, provided a respectable setting for more intimate conversations or for a young couple's courtship. They were small, outdoor parlors, blurring the line between the cultivated home and the cultivated landscape. The ancient art of topiary, which involves clipping shrubs and trees into ornamental shapes, saw a great revival during this period. Yew and boxwood hedges were meticulously trimmed into geometric forms, whimsical animals, or architectural shapes. This practice demonstrated the gardener's ultimate control over nature, shaping it into a living sculpture that was both orderly and impressive. Many of these gardens followed a style known as the gardenesque. The goal of this style was to arrange plants in an artful but naturalistic way that would show off the unique beauty of each individual specimen. Unlike the rigid formality of earlier periods, the gardenesque garden was a place of gentle curves, carefully composed scenes, and a deep appreciation for the character of each tree and flower, like seeing a single perfect dewdrop clinging to a rose petal. And here, in the tranquility of a garden, our story comes to a gentle close. We have walked the crowded streets, sat in the silent drawing rooms, and danced in the grand ballrooms of a world that was both magnificent and incredibly strict. We've felt its pressures and admired its strange and detailed beauty. I hope this journey has been a peaceful and relaxing one for you. Thank you so much for joining me tonight and for making this channel a small part of your routine. Your presence here means the world. If you've enjoyed our time together, please consider liking or subscribing. It truly helps our community grow. But for now, the most important thing is for you to rest. May your mind be calm and your dreams be peaceful. Until next time, sleep well.